By the time Mara Collins led Ruby down the steel ramp at the Red River Hereford sale, she already knew what people were going to look at first. It was not Ruby's shoulders. It was not her feet. It was not the fact that she had gained almost 3 pounds a day on grass and hay and had never needed more than routine vaccinations. They looked at her face. A Hereford was supposed to have a white face. Everybody in that barn knew that. Ruby had one too, technically. The problem was that only half of it was white. A clean line ran from the middle of her forehead, down beside her left eye, across her nose, almost straight to the edge of her mouth. One side looked like the picture on every Hereford breeder's calendar in America. The other side was dark red. Somebody behind Mara said, "Looks like she forgot to finish getting dressed." A few people laughed. Then Clayton Mercer walked over. Clayton owned Mercer Herefords, which meant he owned more cattle than Mara could count without a spreadsheet, more pasture than she could drive across before lunch, and enough influence in the county that people laughed a little harder when he was the one telling the joke. He looked Ruby over slowly. Then he said, loud enough for everybody around them to hear, "A Hereford that can't even get the white face right isn't breeding stock." He offered Mara slaughter price. She told him no. 5 days later, Mara was standing in her kitchen with a phone pressed to her ear when a geneticist from a laboratory in Stillwater asked her a question she would never forget. "Miss Collins, are you absolutely certain every sample labeled Ruby came from the same cow?" That question was the reason Clayton Mercer would eventually have to stand at the end of Mara's driveway and ask her permission to take part in a genetics study built around the animal he had called worthless. But at the Red River sale that morning, Mara knew none of that. She only knew she needed money. She had been awake since 4:36. The exact time mattered, because when somebody owed a bank enough money, strange numbers had a way of sticking. The payment on Mara's operating note was due November 18th. There was $13,740 in the farm account. She needed a little over $21,000. The hay supplier wanted cash. The North well pump had started making a grinding sound that everybody kept telling her was probably nothing, which was farm language for start setting money aside. And she had 23 registered Herefords on 46 acres that had spent the summer getting browner every week. Her father used to say, a cow could turn grass into money. That summer, Redgate Farm had mostly turned money into hay. Ruby was supposed to help. She was 28 months old, deep-bodied, calm, structurally sound, and from a cow family Mara had spent 13 years trying to improve. On paper, Ruby should have been one of the easiest animals on the place to sell. In person, she looked like somebody had made 2 different Herefords and stopped halfway through choosing between them. Mara had known she was unusual from the night she was born. Her mother, Maple, calved in the back lot during a cold rain in March. Mara found the calf around midnight, still wet, with Maple standing over her and licking her ribs. Mara shined a flashlight toward the calf's face, and at first thought mud had gotten on it. Then the calf turned her head. The left side was white, the right side was red. Not mottled, not freckled, not a little colored patch around the eye, which happened now and then. This was different. The border was so sharp that Mara wiped at it with her glove. Nothing came off. Over the next few months, more unusual markings became obvious. There was a narrow red streak cutting through the white along Ruby's shoulder. One rear leg carried a line where white hair stopped and red hair began almost as if somebody had used masking tape. Ruby did not know she looked strange. That was probably the best thing about her. She was healthy from the beginning. She ate. She grew. She followed people around the pen. Whenever Mara worked fence, Ruby would stand 10 yards away and watch as if she had been assigned quality control. But cattle people noticed pattern. Especially Hereford people. Breed identity mattered. Markings mattered. Uniformity mattered. Buyers wanted to know what they were putting into a herd. So Ruby collected nicknames. Half-face, paint job, split screen. One man at the feed store called her the before and after cow. Most of it was delivered as humor. That was how people in livestock country sometimes got away with being cruel without having to admit they were being cruel. They smiled. The person on the receiving end was expected to smile too. If Mara did not, suddenly the problem was no longer what they had said. The problem was that she was too sensitive. By the time she hauled Ruby to the Red River sale, Mara had heard almost every version. She told herself she did not care. She did. The sale barn was already busy when she pulled in. Diesel trucks lined the gravel. Calves bawled from holding pens. Men stood around drinking coffee from paper cups, while pretending not to look at everybody else's cattle. Mara backed her old trailer toward the unloading area and dropped the ramp. Ruby walked out behind her. 3 conversations stopped. Mara heard one man say, "There she is." That bothered her more than the jokes. "There she is" meant people had already been talking. Dr. Ellis Grant was the first person who came over and did not smile. Ellis had been the large animal veterinarian in the area longer than Mara had been alive. He was 68, moved slowly because one knee had been replaced and the other probably should have been, and could look at a cow from 30 feet away and tell which foot was bothering her. He stood beside Ruby and stared at her face. Then he stepped closer. "Has she always been like this?" "Since birth," Mara said. "No change?" "None." Ellis put on his glasses. That was when Mara started paying attention. Ellis did not put his glasses on for ordinary things. He ran 2 fingers along the line where the white hair met the red near Ruby's cheek. Then he walked around her. He found the narrow color boundary near her shoulder. He looked at the rear leg. "Any health problems?" "Never." "Cycle normally?" "As far as I can tell." "Registered?" Mara nodded. Ellis asked if she still had Maple's breeding record. She said she did somewhere. Then he asked something she had not expected. "Would you let me pull some hair?" "For what?" He shrugged. "I know a woman at a livestock genetics lab who likes unusual pigment cases. This is unusual." He said it in such a flat, professional voice that Mara almost laughed. He took a small bundle of hair with follicles from Ruby's white side, then another from the red side. After that, he drew a tube of blood. He wrote everything down carefully. White face, red face, blood, same animal, same date. He had Mara sign a sample release on the hood of his truck. She did not imagine that piece of paper would matter much. 20 minutes later, Clayton Mercer arrived. People could always tell when Clayton came into a livestock event because men who had been standing comfortably suddenly seemed to remember their posture. Mercer Herefords had been around since his grandfather bought their first registered cows in 1958. They sold bulls across 6 states. They hosted an annual production sale with catered food and printed catalogs thick enough to stop a door. Clayton was 54, broad-shouldered, always clean, always shaved, and somehow able to spend an entire morning around cattle without manure ever touching his boots. He saw Ruby. Then he saw the people around Ruby. That second part mattered. Clayton liked an audience. He walked over and asked Mara whether she was seriously considering breeding her. "That depends on what I learn," Mara said. Clayton glanced at Ruby's face. "Learn what?" "Whether there's anything behind the color." He smiled. "There's color behind the color." A couple of men laughed. Then Clayton gave everybody within 15 feet a short lecture about breed consistency. He said commercial buyers paid for predictability. He said registered breeders had a responsibility to protect type. He said a breeder could forgive a little variation, but a serious breeding program did not build around question marks. Then he said Ruby was exactly the sort of animal sentiment kept alive longer than economics should. That was Clayton's gift. He could insult someone in a way that sounded like a business seminar. He pulled out his phone, tapped the calculator, showed Mara a number. It was $540 below what a normal young Hereford cow of Ruby's weight should have been worth that morning. He said he would take her immediately. Cash transfer, No commission. No hauling her home. You'd be out from under the feed bill, he said. Mara looked at the number. She needed money badly enough that for about 3 seconds she could hear her father's voice telling her not to get emotional about livestock. Then she looked at Ruby. Ruby was chewing hay somebody had dropped near the fence. No. Clayton tilted his head. Your choice. He waited. Mara thought he expected an explanation. She did not give him one. That changed the mood. People like Clayton were comfortable when somebody argued with them, because argument meant they were still setting the terms. Silence was harder. Finally, Clayton said, "Don't let being embarrassed today cost you money tomorrow." Then he walked away. Mara loaded Ruby back into the trailer and drove home. The whole way, she kept thinking about the banknote. She also kept thinking about Ellis putting on his glasses. 6 days later, a white Mercer Hereford's pickup turned into her driveway. The young man who got out was named Travis Bell. Mara knew him well enough to say hello at the co-op and not well enough to know his wife's name. He stood beside the porch and told her Clayton had reconsidered. He'd like to improve the offer. Why? Travis looked at the ground. Just trying to be fair. The new number was more than twice Clayton's sale barn offer. Not a fortune, but enough that Mara could have paid for hay and bought herself breathing room. She asked Travis what had changed about Ruby in 6 days. He said he did not know. Neither do I, Mara said. Then she told him no again. He drove away. The laboratory called the following afternoon. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Hannah Price, from Plains Agricultural Genomics. She asked whether Mara owned a Hereford cow named Ruby Collins 17. Mara said she did. Hannah confirmed her address, confirmed Ellis Grant had collected the samples. Then she asked whether Mara was certain the white face hair, the red face hair, and the blood had all come from one animal. Mara laughed because the question sounded ridiculous. Ellis pulled them while I was standing there. Hannah did not laugh. Can you describe exactly how the samples were taken? So Mara did. Hannah asked whether there had been other animals in the chute. No. Whether Ellis had changed gloves. Mara could not remember. Whether the envelopes had been open at the same time. She could not remember that either. Finally, Mara asked what was wrong. There was a pause. The markers aren't lining up the way they should. What does that mean? It means I don't want to tell you what I think it means until I know the samples are clean. That was all Mara got. 2 days later, Ellis came back out. This time, Hannah Price came with him. She was younger than Mara expected, maybe late 30s, wearing jeans, work boots, and a university jacket under a canvas coat. She brought 2 hard plastic cases, labels, sterile tubes, cameras, and enough disposable gloves to make Mara's little working pen look like a crime scene. Hannah explained everything before touching Ruby. They were going to recollect, carefully. Separate instruments, separate bags, separate labels. Full chain of custody. They took blood, cheek cells, hair from the white side of Ruby's face, hair from the red side, hair from the shoulder boundary. Small skin punches from both color regions. They photographed each location. Ellis initialed every label. Mara initialed every label. Hannah wrote down the time. When they finished, she looked exhausted. Mara asked whether Ruby was sick. No! Is she some kind of cross? Her registration says no. Registration papers have been wrong before. That's true. Then what are you looking for? Hannah closed the sample case. An explanation. In a town with fewer than 3,000 people, 2 laboratory vehicles at one small Hereford farm qualified as public entertainment. By Friday, everybody knew. By Monday, nobody knew the same version. At the feed store, Mara heard Ruby was part bison. At church, a woman asked whether she had been genetically modified. Mara's neighbor said somebody had told him she bought an embryo off the internet. Mara told him she had trouble ordering socks off the internet. Clayton handled the rumors better than she did. At the co-op counter, With half a dozen cattlemen standing around, he said people should not confuse testing with value. Every breeder has seen an odd one, he said. A lab coat doesn't make an odd cow important. That sentence got repeated to Mara 3 times in one day. That evening, Travis called again. The Mercer offer had gone up. A lot. Mara wrote it on the back of her electric bill. It was enough to pay the operating note, repair the well, buy hay, and leave several $1,000s in the account. She sat at the kitchen table staring at the number. She had spent the whole summer worrying about money. Here was money. She called Travis back. Why does Clayton want her? He likes the cow. He called her a question mark. People change their minds. In 10 days, Travis exhaled. I just bring the offers, Mara. Then bring him my answer. She said no. Afterward, she sat in the dark kitchen, wondering whether she had just protected her farm or destroyed it. Hannah returned 3 weeks later. This time she brought Dr. Samir Patel from Oklahoma State and a laptop. They did not build suspense. Scientists, Mara decided, were terrible at theater. Hannah opened a folder and started with the simplest point. Ruby was a registered Hereford. There was no evidence she had been crossed with another species or another cattle breed. No genetic engineering. No laboratory manipulation. Nothing exotic in the way people in town had been imagining. The unusual part was inside Ruby herself. Different tissues were repeatedly producing 2 distinct genetic profiles. The white side of her face strongly matched one profile. The red side strongly matched the other. Her blood was mostly one. Cells from inside her cheek showed both. They had run the samples more than once. Then they sent duplicate material to a second laboratory. Same result. Mara asked how one cow could have 2 sets of DNA. Samir turned the laptop toward her. He had made a diagram because apparently he had correctly guessed she would need one. He showed 2 fertilized embryos. Then he showed them coming together very early in development. In rare cases, he said, 2 embryos can fuse and continue as one individual. You're saying Ruby was twins? Not exactly. That sounds exactly like twins, Samir smiled. Think of it as 2 starting cell populations contributing to one body. The word they used was chimera. Mara had heard the word before, but mostly in mythology. A creature made out of different animals. That was not what Ruby was. She was entirely cattle, entirely Hereford. The strange part was that different groups of cells inside her came from 2 different genetic starting points. Some of Ruby was genetically one embryo, some was genetically the other. The 2 had become one animal long before there was anything recognizable as a calf. Then Hannah explained the markings. Pigment cells move through a developing embryo in patterns. If 2 cell populations carry slightly different instructions affecting color, the visible coat can sometimes trace where those populations ended up. Ruby's split face might be more than a funny marking. It might be a map. Samir pointed to the photograph of Ruby's forehead. If the pattern continues to correlate with tissue lineage, the way these samples suggest, we can identify areas before we sample them. Mara did not understand why that mattered, so he explained. Most chimerism is invisible. Researchers may discover mixed genetic material, but they cannot look at an animal and see where one cell lineage dominates and another begins. Ruby appeared to give them external landmarks. Her color boundaries made parts of the internal biology visible. That made her scientifically useful, not magical, not priceless, useful. Mara asked the obvious question. What's she worth? Hannah leaned back. That depends what you mean by worth. Dollars. Hannah laughed once. Then she explained that nobody was about to hand Mara a $1 million check. Ruby was not carrying a cure for cancer. She was not producing a superior beef trait. She was not the beginning of some new breed. What the university wanted was access. Repeated sampling over time. Imaging. Health records. Possibly reproductive monitoring if Mara chose to breed her. A long-term data set. Mara assumed the next sentence would be an offer to buy her. Instead, Samir said, We would strongly prefer she stay here. Mara thought she had misunderstood. Here? On your farm? Transporting Ruby to a university facility would change her environment. Different feed. Different stress. Different management. If they wanted years of consistent data, keeping her where she had already lived her entire life made sense. They wanted to pay Mara an annual site fee, cover veterinary procedures associated with the study, pay for each scheduled research visit, and license study data under a contract that required Mara's written approval for sampling. Ruby would remain hers. The research would come to her. Mara did the math before they finished talking. It was not enough money to turn Redgate Farm into Mercer Hereford's. It was enough to keep Redgate Farm from becoming somebody else's pasture. That difference mattered. The first industry article came out in November. The headline called Ruby a rare visually traceable bovine chimera. There was a photograph of her standing beside Mara's north fence. Mara had seen almost the same picture passed around in text messages with jokes under it. Now the exact same face had arrows pointing toward pigment boundaries and a caption from a university geneticist. Same cow, different audience. Clayton Mercer came to the farm 3 days later, alone. That was new. He stood at the fence for a while, looking at Ruby. Then he made Mara an offer that was so high she stopped thinking in terms of cows. It was land money, house money, the kind of number a person heard differently, depending on how much she owed the bank. Mara asked what he wanted to do with Ruby. Put her where she can have some visibility. She has visibility. You know what I mean. Mara did. Mercer Hereford's had recently started marketing itself around genetics. Their website had a new section about genomic progress. They were planning a spring breeder conference. They had hired a marketing agency out of Tulsa. Then Ruby happened. A nationally interesting genetics case. A registered Hereford, standing 40 miles away on a farm with peeling paint on the working pens. If Clayton owned Ruby, Mercer Herefords would not have to explain why somebody else had discovered the most talked-about Hereford genetics case in the region. They could simply become part of the story. Mara said no. Clayton's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. He looked back at Ruby. Then he asked, almost casually, Maple was bred AI, wasn't she? Mara nodded. Mercer Atlas 412. Something cold moved through her stomach. Atlas was a Mercer bull. Mara's father had bought semen through their breeding service years earlier. Clayton knew it, and he knew Mara knew it. He put his hands in his coat pockets. You might want to check what rights were attached to that genetic material. What rights? I'm just saying ownership can get complicated. Ruby is my cow. I didn't say she wasn't. Then what are you saying? Clayton smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it now. I'm saying research has commercial value. The letter arrived 9 days later. Thick paper. Law firm in Oklahoma City. Words like proprietary genetic interests. Derived data. Breeding program assets. Commercial exploitation. The letter did not directly claim Ruby belonged to Mercer. That would have been easy to fight. Instead, it raised questions. Questions were cheaper than answers if somebody had money. The university called the next morning. They were not ending the project. They were pausing the long-term agreement until ownership and data rights were clear. The interim payment stopped. The November note did not. Neither did the noise coming from the well pump. For 3 days, Mara was angrier at herself than at Clayton. She had turned down more money than she had ever seen because she believed she was protecting something. Now the research contract was frozen, the bank wanted its payment, and the expensive cow in her pasture was eating the same hay she had eaten when everybody thought she was worthless. Hannah gave Mara the name of an agricultural attorney named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca practiced in Enid and had spent 26 years arguing about water rights, seed contracts, breeding agreements, lease boundaries, livestock ownership, and every other thing rural people shook hands over until enough money appeared. She asked Mara for every document connected to Maple's breeding. Mara told her that her father had handled it. Did he keep records? Mara laughed. Her father kept receipts for bolts. They found the paperwork in a gray filing cabinet in the shop. There it was. Mercer Hereford's breeding services. 2 units of semen from Atlas 412. Technician fee. Storage fee. Sales tax. Paid. Stapled behind the invoice was the breeding agreement. Rebecca read it twice. Then she called Mara. No retained ownership clause. Mara sat down. What does that mean? It means they sold your father breeding material under this contract. They did not reserve a share of the resulting calf. Can they claim the genetics? They can own rights in what they sold. That does not automatically make them owner of every animal produced from a completed breeding service. Then Rebecca made the argument that mattered even more. The research value was not Atlas 412. Ruby was interesting because of the fusion event. The 2-cell lineage condition had arisen during early embryonic development. Mercer had not selected for it, had not advertised it, had not created it, could not point to a breeding program designed to produce it. Their bull might have contributed paternal DNA to one of the embryos. That did not mean Mercer had manufactured Ruby's chimerism. Rebecca's response was 5 pages. She attached the contract, the paid invoice, Ruby's registration, Ellis Grant's collection notes, a statement from Hannah explaining what chimerism was and why it was not a conventional inherited product of a breeding line. Then Rebecca asked Mercer to identify, specifically, the contract language granting them ownership or control over Ruby or research derived from her. They never did. 12 days later, the law firm sent a much shorter letter. Mercer Herefords had only sought clarification. They were not asserting ownership of Ruby. They were not asserting veto authority over the study. They were not asserting ownership of the university's data. Clarification had apparently been achieved. The research agreement was signed the following week. The first payment hit Mara's account on a Wednesday morning. She paid the bank Wednesday afternoon. Then she sat in her pickup in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. Not because she had become rich, because she had not lost the place. That winter, the university held a public presentation at the County Extension Center. They invited breeders, veterinarians, cattle producers, and local agriculture reporters. Clayton came because the County Hereford Association had been invited as a group. He sat 3 rows behind Mara. Hannah spoke for 40 minutes. She showed Ruby's photographs, then the genetic profiles, then the tissue map. She explained the difference between a crossbred animal and a chimera. She explained that Ruby's unusual appearance was not evidence she was less of a Hereford. It was evidence of an uncommon developmental event that happened before she had a heartbeat. Then Hannah explained the research agreement. Ruby would remain at Redgate Farm. Mara would retain ownership. Sampling required her authorization. The farm would serve as the primary study site. There was a silence in that room Mara had never heard at a cattle meeting. Nobody was laughing. During questions, a livestock reporter stood up. He had apparently found the sale day story. He asked Clayton whether Mercer Herefords had recognized Ruby's potential early. Clayton gave a polished answer. He said Mercer had always known she was unusual. He said his operation had made multiple offers. He said those offers demonstrated serious interest. Every word was technically arranged to avoid being false. Then Ellis Grant spoke from the side wall. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "You also said she wasn't breeding stock." That was it. The room went quiet again. Clayton looked at him. Ellis looked back. Nobody rescued the moment with a joke. Eventually Clayton nodded once. "We all learn." Then somebody asked Hannah another question. Mara thought that was the end of Clayton Mercer and Ruby. It was not. The final turn came the following spring. The researchers had mapped Ruby's 2-cell lineages as far as they could, using samples from Ruby herself. To go further, they wanted better reference material from the paternal side. Atlas 412 had been dead for 3 years, but his stored semen, sequencing records, pedigree genotypes, and archived test material still existed. All of it belonged to Mercer Hereford's. Hannah called Mara before approaching Clayton. She explained that the study could continue without the archive. But the archive would make the analysis stronger, Mara told her to ask. Clayton responded within 2 days. He offered complete access, sequencing files, stored samples, pedigree records, everything. There was one condition. Mercer Hereford's wanted to be named as a formal research partner. Not a data supplier, a partner. Equal branding and public announcements. Their logo on presentation material. Their name beside Redgate Farm in media communication. They even sent suggested language for a press release. Hannah forwarded it to Rebecca. Rebecca forwarded one sentence back. The research agreement said any expansion of participating parties required written approval from Ruby's owner, Mara Collins. Clayton drove to Redgate Farm the following week. No company pickup, no employee, no attorney. Just Clayton in an older truck Mara had never seen before. She was replacing a broken latch on the sorting gate when he walked up. He waited while she finished tightening the bolt. That was new too. At the sale barn, Clayton had spoken as though Mara's time belonged to him. At her gate, he waited for hers. When she finished, he explained the archive. 40 years of records. Multiple generations of genomic data. Stored samples that could help the university distinguish which markers came from which paternal line. He said it would be useful. Mara agreed. Then Clayton stopped talking. For once, there was no speech after the point. Mara understood exactly what he needed. He needed her signature. She could have said no. Nobody would have blamed her. She had imagined saying no to Clayton Mercer more than once. In her imagination, it always felt wonderful. Standing there in daylight with Ruby grazing 50 yards behind him, it felt smaller than she expected. The data mattered. The researchers had done good work. Mara did not want useful information locked in a freezer because she disliked the man who owned the freezer. So she told Clayton she would approve access. His shoulders loosened. Then Mara told him the conditions. Mercer Hereford's would be listed as a contributing data source, not a discovery partner. They would have no ownership interest in Ruby, no authority over study design, no approval rights over publication. They could not use Ruby's name, photograph, likeness, or research status to advertise cattle, semen, sales, breeder events, websites, or promotional campaigns without Mara's separate written permission. They could not describe Ruby as a Mercer discovery. They could not describe Mercer Hereford's as the research site. Every public document would identify Ruby as owned, raised, and housed at Redgate Farm. Clayton listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, he asked, "Anything else?" "Put it in writing." Rebecca did. Clayton signed. The archived material went to the university. The study moved forward, and that was where the story became much less dramatic, which was probably why it mattered more. 16 months later, Mara's house still needed paint. Her pickup still pulled slightly to the right. The north gate still dragged when the ground was wet. Redgate Farm had not turned into some genetics empire. Nobody had built a visitor center. Nobody had offered Mara millions of dollars. She still checked hay prices before checking the weather. But the operating note was current. The well had a new pump. Winter hay was stacked behind the barn and already paid for. Ruby was 4 now. Heavy, calm, completely unimpressed by academia. Researchers came several times a year. Ruby tolerated them because they brought range cubes. Her face looked exactly the way it had the night she was born. Half white, half red. Same straight boundary, same strange shoulder marking, same rear leg. Nothing about Ruby changed when people stopped laughing. Nothing about her changed when the laboratory called. Nothing changed when the article came out. Nothing changed when Clayton's first low offer became a number big enough to make Mara's hands shake. The cow stayed the same. What changed was the information around her. At the sale barn, people looked at Ruby and saw a failure to match the picture in their heads. The scientists looked at the same markings and saw a question. Then they kept looking long enough to find an answer. Ellis asked Mara one fall afternoon whether she regretted turning down Clayton's biggest offer. She thought about it. There had been days when selling Ruby would have made her life easier. There had been nights when Mara lay awake doing bank arithmetic and wondered whether principle was just a prettier word for stubbornness. So she did not give Ellis some noble answer. "No," she said, "but I came close." Ellis nodded. Then he scratched Ruby under the jaw. Ruby leaned into him and nearly knocked him sideways. Mara told him Clayton had been right about one thing. Breeders did need to know what they were looking at. Uniformity mattered. Structure mattered, health mattered, genetics mattered, standards existed for reasons. What Clayton got wrong was believing that a difference he did not understand had to be a defect. Those were not the same thing. There was a particular kind of confidence that came from being successful for a long time. A person could start thinking experience meant every possible category had already been seen. Good cow, bad cow, breeding animal, cull, asset, problem. Look once, choose the box, move on. Ruby did not fit Clayton's box, so Clayton priced her as though the problem belonged to her. That was the part Mara kept thinking about. He had better cattle facilities than she did, better records, more land, more employees, more money, more years of breeding history printed in glossy catalogs. He had stood close enough to Ruby at that sale to put a hand on her neck, and the only thing he saw was a Hereford that did not look the way he expected. Ellis had stood in almost the same place. He looked at the same cow. He did not know what she was either. The difference was that Ellis noticed what he did not know. That had been enough to make him pull a few hairs. A few hairs became a laboratory test. A laboratory test became another test, then another. And eventually a cow people had been joking about became a research animal scientists wanted to follow for years. Some evenings, Ruby stood near the west fence where the sun came across the pasture low enough to make the red side of her face look almost copper. The white side caught the light first. From the road, the split was visible even at a distance. People used to slow down because she looked wrong. Now people slowed down because they had heard about her. Ruby did not care why. She lifted her head, looked at the vehicle, decided whether anybody had feed, then went back to grass. And after everything that had happened, that was perhaps the clearest part of the whole story. Ruby had never suddenly become valuable. She had never transformed from one kind of animal into another. She had not changed when the crowd laughed. She had not changed when the scientists became interested. She had not changed when Clayton Mercer finally stood at Mara Collins's gate and waited for permission. The value had been there before anybody understood how to describe it. Sometimes the difference between a flaw and a discovery was not the thing being looked at. Sometimes it was simply whether somebody was willing to look twice.